In February 1979, China sent more than 200,000 troops into Vietnam. On paper, the People's Liberation Army had overwhelming numbers. But what General Song Zipei discovered during that war was something very unsettling. The PLA didn't lose in Vietnam just because it ran out of bullets. It lost also because it ran out of truth. Let me give you just one example. At one point in the war, a Chinese tank unit radioed up to Corps headquarters that it was in fierce fighting with enemy armor. That sounded terrifying because enemy tanks meant a major Vietnamese counterattack. So Corps headquarters ordered other units to halt their advances and prepare to fight this armored threat. Then the tankers sent another report. They had spotted 30 enemy tanks hiding under camouflage near Cao Bang on one hill. 30 tanks. That meant the Vietnamese were reinforcing Cao Bang with at least an armored regiment. Plans had to be rewritten. Units that had just broken through Vietnamese defenses were now ordered to stop. Some were even ordered to retreat to reorganize the lines. Except none of it was real. The enemy tanks weren't tanks at all. They were piles of dirt. They weren't even near Cao Bang. They were in another province. And when the Chinese tank unit realized its mistake, they didn't tell anyone. So Corps headquarters spent days planning against a phantom enemy that did not exist, while the real road to Cao Bang lay open to them. In one especially disastrous case, a Chinese tank company was ordered to pull back from the ground they had just conquered to deal with this imaginary armored threat. The infantry units supporting them obeyed the order and retreated, but the tankers disobeyed. They knew something was wrong with the order, so they stayed put. But the tanks now were alone deep in Vietnamese territory. You can probably guess what happened next. They were destroyed. This was not bad luck. This was a system that had stopped telling the truth to itself. And Song Zipei, a major general equivalent inside that system, was furious about this because this was not an isolated incident. It happened again and again. Units in wrong villages, on the wrong hills, reporting enemies that didn't exist, and hiding mistakes that then got other people killed. And behind all of that was something much deeper than bad maps or faulty radios. It was fear. Fear of admitting error. Fear of telling superiors bad news, and fear of being blamed for one's own mistakes. That fear, Song believed, was just as deadly as Vietnamese ambushes. And in this episode, I want to show you how a modern army, and one that had brave, disciplined soldiers, nearly collapsed because its information system broke down. First came hunger. The Chinese army in 1979 didn't enter Vietnam planning to starve. They went in planning to move fast. The whole invasion was designed around speed. The spearhead units, the ones that actually broke into Vietnam, were only supposed to be in front for one day. By nightfall on day one, they were supposed to have seized their objectives, and their supply columns could catch up from behind them. That's why those soldiers crossed the border carrying virtually nothing. In PLA terms, they were issued 1/4 of a unit of fire. Going by the book, that meant that a rifleman might only have 70 or 80 rounds, and a machine gun team, a few hundred, just enough to fight for a short time, but no more. They were meant to hit hard, move fast, and then be resupplied promptly. But none of that happened. The Vietnamese waylaid the supply porters constantly. Any hill, any tree line, any village might grow Vietnamese machine guns and halt them. So Chinese units moved forward only slowly and painfully, and their supply columns fell farther and farther behind. And those supply columns were not combat units. They were made up of militia porters lumbering slowly in columns of 1,000 or more, leading mules loaded with rice and ammunition. And the Vietnamese knew quite well those columns were the PLA's lifeline and jugular vein. So they ambushed them and cut them. A column of porters would cross a river, gunfire would explode from the jungle, and men and animals would go down in heaps. Chaos would erupt, and maybe a political officer would rush forward and try to rally the survivors. Most often, he would be shot dead trying to do it. And thus, supply lines were severed. Frontline units then began to run out of food and ammunition and even water. And as that happened, another fear took hold: the radios. In the previous episode, we saw how Vietnamese radio operators learned to impersonate the PLA's own chain of command. They used Chinese codes and Chinese call signs, and they told Chinese units to move, and those units obeyed. So now, Chinese units began to suspect their own radios. Some officers apparently convinced themselves that even if they turned a radio on, the Vietnamese could somehow track them the way a modern cell phone can be tracked today. So they ordered radios turned off, which meant that when a supply column got ambushed, often it couldn't call for help. There was nobody to call who had a radio powered on. And when a combat unit quietly relocated to avoid detection by the enemy, sometimes it forgot to tell anyone. And so the supply porters, loyal, obedient, and virtually defenseless, would be marching to that unit's last known location, walk straight into a Vietnamese kill zone, and die trying to resupply troops who weren't even there anymore. And as those columns slowed to a trickle and evaporated, they couldn't feed the fighting troops, and hunger set in. General Song records something really remarkable in his memoir. Despite everything, despite the fear and the thirst and the starvation, discipline mostly held among the troops. When Chinese units would find a little food, usually there wasn't enough for everyone. And so some of the men would refuse to eat. One guy would say, "Oh, you take my share. I don't need any." And the other one would say, "No, I'm still full from last week." Sung wrote about party members and Communist Youth League members who would give up their shares of the food entirely to the wounded or the weak. I'm sure he knew that skeptics would call these accounts propaganda, but also he knew that he'd written elsewhere that this army made terrible mistakes at every level, and Sung had no problem decrying them lustily and naming names. So when he said that soldiers endured hunger magnanimously and with dignity, he meant it. Which only makes what happened next more tragic, because the men held, but the system broke. Hunger and thirst weakened the troops, but what killed the army was bad information. Inside Chinese headquarters, officers were constantly being told where units were and what they were fighting and what was happening on the ground, but more and more of that information was wrong. Sometimes it was just attributable to confusion. Maps were bad, villages looked alike, mountains all looked the same in the dark. Okay, and a battalion might think that it was in one village when it was really 10 kilometers away in another village. That was bad, but understandable. What was not understandable was what happened next. When officers realized that they were in the wrong place, many of them simply stayed quiet. They were afraid to admit their own mistakes. Why was that bad? Because they let their error work its way up through the chain of command into the information system, where it got mixed together with other true and false reports into a slurry of half-truth. And that turned into decisions that sent men to useless deaths. At one battle that some of you might remember, a Chinese unit reported confidently that it had seized a critical bridge. Corps headquarters believed them, and so other units were sent to advance over that bridge, which they assumed was now in friendly hands. But it wasn't. So they walked straight into Vietnamese heavy weapons. At another battle, two Chinese divisions became neighbors, but neither one knew exactly where the other one was. One division occupied the wrong village, but reported its position as the strategically important village of Co Thuận. The other division, you might recall, was told to march to Co Thuận to link up with friendly forces, and so it marched into a buzzsaw. The Vietnamese defenders there were very real. The friendly Chinese unit was kilometers away. So 150 more Chinese soldiers died because someone misread a map and then kept mum about his mistake. Over and over, this happened. Chinese units were sent to rescue formations that were never there. Chinese units were ordered to retreat from ground that they had already captured. Battalions were pushed into danger because someone somewhere had been too afraid to admit a mistake. So, in General Song's account after the war, the PLA wasn't just defeated by Vietnamese fire, it was really being defeated by a culture that punished honesty. When that war was over, General Song expected the PLA to do what any serious military would do after a disaster, namely figure out exactly what went wrong, who made the mistakes, and how to prevent them from happening again. But that is not what happened. As Sung tells it, inside 41st Corps, there was an unspoken bargain in the air. Too many people had made too many mistakes, and if everyone told the truth, too many careers would be destroyed. There was a hyper abundance of blame to go around. So responsibility was blurred. Blame was assigned in vague collective terms, like mistakes were made. Everyone could have done better, that kind of thing. What was seldom written was, this man gave this order, and this many people died because of it. When blame was assigned, Sung writes, it generally rolled downhill. A few unlucky officers were singled out as fall guys, and all the extra blame that could be piled on top of them was to spare it from staining other people. And many of those people who had done equally bad or worse things quietly moved on. In fact, Sung records that when the officers returned from the war, they now had combat experience, and about 90% of them were promoted one rank. Not because they had performed brilliantly, but because the institution wanted to move on. And the 10% who weren't promoted often included some of the people who had spoken too honestly about the failures that they had seen. Sung had a word for the mood that this created. He called it ideological confusion. In plain English, what he meant was something simpler. People were demoralized. They could see with their own eyes that honesty was dangerous and that failure was what was being rewarded. Hanging over all of this conspiracy of silence was the deeper legacy of Maoism. Because for more than a decade, PLA officers had been trained and chosen to be not accurate, but politically safe. Young officers were afraid that if they were too careful or too hesitant or just too honest or prudent about danger, that they were going to be accused of lacking revolutionary spirit. So when Song Zipei looked back on the war in Vietnam, he wasn't just angry about tanks chasing dirt piles or units that got lost or radios that were left powered off. He was angry about something much deeper. The PLA of 1979 had brave soldiers. It had disciplined platoons, and it had men who had shared their last crackers and gave their water to the wounded. What it did not have was a command system that could be trusted. Orders were still being issued on the basis of lies. Troop movements got planned on false maps, and whole formations got pushed into danger because no one was willing to say, we made a mistake. That kind of system doesn't fail all at once. It fails quietly, one withheld report at a time, one mislocated unit, one imaginary tank at a time, until suddenly the army no longer knows where it is or who it's fighting or what's actually happening on the ground. And if some of this sounds familiar, it should. We've seen it before. Units acting boldly, but information moving badly, and higher headquarters left struggling to understand what was actually happening below them. In the end, this was not about one battle or one failure of a commander. It was about whether the army could tell itself the truth.